We are live here with Danny Altmann. Danny, please tell us a little bit about yourself. Thank you for being here today.
Great pleasure. So, well, who am I? I'm Professor of Immunology at Imperial College London. So my relevance to these kind of discussions is, on the one hand, I'm an immunologist. I do medical research in the field of immunology on many infectious diseases and autoimmune diseases. And during COVID, I found myself publishing a lot of papers and doing a lot of research during that steep learning curve on, what is COVID-19 and how do we respond to it. And that took me into a lot of work on long COVID. And I also did a lot of, I suppose, advocacy work and public engagement work and interactions with policymakers in different countries, including the UK. And I'm an editor of several medical journals. And I also published a book together with a long COVID sufferer called the Penguin Long COVID Handbook, which was written with Jez Medinger, who's a person who has long COVID.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I guess my name is Amanda Finley. I started COVID-19 Long Haulers discussion group on Facebook, and we love bringing people like you into these conversations so that we can provide context and understanding. So thank you for being here. Let's dive right into this. I'm going to start with question number 5 here first, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can you tell us about your recent publication and what you found? Tell us about you and your studies.
Okay, so well, we actually have 2 recent publications in the last 3 or 4 weeks, so I can very simply and briefly tell you about both of them, if I may, because they're both kind of relevant to discussion. Yeah. So at the end of July, we published a very big paper in a very prestigious journal called Nature Reviews in Immunology, and that was kind of what the name suggests. So it's the place where you kind of pull together the current consensus on a given subject. And I'd been flying from Edinburgh to London with Alexandra Fleming, who's the editor of Nature Reviews in Immunology, firing ideas at her about what kind of stuff she should publish. And we got into the idea that maybe it would be timely to pull together everything that was known about long COVID. That was a bit of a kind of foolish thing to agree to do because well, A, it's a lot of work, and B, the field is still in quite a mess. In fact, as we've moved along over the last 3 years, in some ways, I feel like we agree about less and less, not more and more. So in the end, I submitted it 1 year later than I promised, and it was much longer than promised. I think it was 37,000 words. And I really, together with my co-authors, we really tried to sort of be fair to the current data. And we kind of went through each of the things that people are working on and that mystify people. How many people in the world have long COVID? How do we count it? Why do we disagree about how to count it? What are the hypotheses on the table about what it is? So, people will have read this many times, but I guess the ideas that are out there on the table, and they're not mutually exclusive, it could be any or all of these, are that the virus itself damages your organs, so it gets into your lungs, your liver, your heart, your kidneys, and does damage there. You can see on an MRI or whatever. It could be that it sets up a persistent reservoir somewhere in your body, like in your gut, and continues to stimulate your system and do damage in that way. It could be that it disrupts your white blood cells in a way that's analogous to something like glandular fever, and sends your immune system haywire. It could be that it triggers autoimmunity, a bit like other viruses that we know. Or it could be that it gets into your endothelial cells and causes coagulation defects and blood clotting defects and things like that. So there's this whole section discussing the pros and cons of all of those. And then we discuss whether people who have long COVID have it because there was something different about the way they responded to the virus in the first place. And then we discuss all that evidence in each of those sections, really. Tissue damage seen on imaging, altered immune subsets, autoimmunity, coagulation differences. We talk about nervous system differences, and then we try and pull it all together by trying to talk about what that means about where we are at the moment in terms of drug trials and new therapeutics and how to help people. And so to cut a long story short, we end up trying to explain an awful lot of things. And you could conclude all of those 37,000 words by saying the jury is still out, but there's a very small number of things that we've come to agree on.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal paper. So
Thank
really,
you. Thank you.
yeah, it's great.
And so sorry, very briefly, without going on and on. Today we published another paper, a research paper, which was a much simpler paper. It's in a journal called another Nature journal, Nature Communications, and there we asked a very simple question: when you mix with long haulers, there are many, people do a lot of their own research and their own reading, and there are many assumptions out there, and some of them are actually mutually opposed. There are some people who think they got their long COVID because they made a sort of inadequate immune response to the virus when they first met it and had poor immunity. And there are other people who, because of their symptoms and the way they feel, almost feel the opposite, like they made too big an immune response or a hyperinflammatory immune response and have too much inflammation going on and responded too strongly to the virus when they met it. So we tested out those hypotheses in a very simple way, almost a kind of simple-minded way. We took our cohort of healthcare workers, our hospital workers in London, during the first wave in 2020, and we followed them weekly with their symptom diaries and antibody tests and T-cell tests during that first year. And we were able, therefore, to stratify them into all those who became infected, which ones recovered quickly, and which ones got persistent symptoms that looked like long COVID. And then we compared everything we could think of to compare in their blood tests, antibody responses, neutralizing antibody responses, CD4 T-cell responses, to see if we could tell the difference, if there was any difference between those two groups. And the simple answer is we found no differences at all. They both had made an identical immune response to the virus. So that's our new paper.
Okay, well, wow, thank you. I'm so glad to hear there's something more for us to dive into here after we're done.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's just take it from the top. We'll go to question number 1. Why don't some people seroconvert? I heard it's maybe a third of people. What are the mechanisms behind that, and what are those implications?
Yeah, so I just feel that during the last three and a half years, people have learned so much immunology. By people, I mean partly myself. I've done a lot of it, but I mean, everybody else who wasn't a card-carrying immunologist have learned terms and tests and language, and grasp of the topic in a really admirable way. And I've spent my whole life studying genetic variation in immunity. I particularly love immunogenetics and differences across the planet in how we respond to different things, and why some people make high immune responses and some people make low immune responses. And my immune response to hepatitis might be enormous, and to tuberculosis tiny, and you might be the other way around. And what is it about us and our lifestyle and our genetics that makes it like that? It's like a lot of biology, isn't it? In the end, you just say nature plus nurture. And there's a lot of human variation out there. And the first time we ever looked at real life immune responses to this virus, when we knew nothing about it and we didn't know what to expect, in that first cohort we looked at, the healthcare workers in London, it was very diverse and very striking that a lot of supposedly fit, healthy people going about their business in London, just going to work every day. There were nurses and doctors and hospital porters and receptionists and all kind of people who worked there, and the range of immunity was enormous. Some had simply huge antibodies and huge T cells. Some had huge antibodies and no T cells. Some had huge T cells and no antibodies. It just tells you that humans are a very diverse bunch.
Yeah, I think that, and that's something that we want we want so much to have discrete answers, but
Yeah,
those discrete answers just it's Victor Turner, the anthropologist who studied liminal areas. We don't always have black and
yeah.
white. This one, I've heard this a little bit as well. Does anyone feel like your immune system is completely useless after vaccines or boosters? And I would also posit after having COVID as well. Curious to see if anybody else has felt like this. What are some possible responses to
Yeah, well, let me kind of deconstruct that
that?
question into different components. Yeah, so there's
Yeah.
the first part of the answer is kind of the thing I just said. Yeah, that that there's human heterogeneity out there, genetic heterogeneity. We're all different, and it goes without saying that if we were to take 1,000 people and line them up and give them an identical Pfizer mRNA vaccine, inevitably there would be a range of values with a kind of bell-shaped distribution, and some would be at the bottom of that distribution with almost no immunity, and some would be at the top with lots of immunity, and a big cluster of people in the middle, because that's true of all kind of genetic traits, isn't it? So that's the simple starting answer. And then there's another discussion that goes around the world of long COVID very strongly, which is has it damaged your immune response? Are people doomed thereafter to make poor immune responses to vaccines, to boosters, to other infections? God, that's a really difficult discussion. So when I said a moment ago that we've done more and more research and almost have less and less consensus, I describe that as an area of poor consensus, that a great many immunologists, including ourselves, have done a great many tests on a great many people to look at, a very devastating virus has got into your body. It's done a lot of things. One of the hypotheses I mentioned is that it's disrupted your white blood cells and disrupted the interaction of the different subsets. Why shouldn't it destroy your immune response or make it rubbish or alter it? It's definitely one of the hypotheses on the table. There are some very kind of siloed and polarized schools of thought about how people interpret the data. Some people say, yes, it's a very immune system damaging virus that's exhausted your lymphocytes and made them very poor at responding to things. And they feel very passionate about that view. Other people take the opposite view from their analysis of their data and say, if anything, it's either left your immune system intact or maybe even sort of tuned it up a little bit and activated it a little bit extra. So there's a wonderful paper from maybe 6 months ago in Nature from a lab in Bethesda at NIH from John Sang, as in Tsang, which is really, really good. So not a very helpful answer, is it? Just to say there's divergence of opinion with lots of different observations out there, and it's one of the bits of the story that we're kind of fighting over at the moment.
Yeah, and that is just going to be the case. This has impacted how many billions of people at this point.
Billions, yeah.
Yeah, there just will not be a black and white answer. So,
yeah.
Let's talk about MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome. What symptoms should we look for? How does it relate to long COVID, and how do we recognize and treat it?
Yeah, I mean, so you've got another one here. So when I talk about contentious subjects, this is probably the most contentious, I think.
Yeah.
So people by now probably know that mast cells are another type of white blood cell, part of your immune system that are, very angry cells, that in evolutionary terms, as we've evolved on the planet, are one of the family of cells that appear in things like allergic and asthmatic responses, because they're to do with those really hyper-inflammatory, angry responses that we've needed throughout evolution as mammals on planet Earth to do things like getting rid of parasites and stuff like that. If you're living in modern day New York or London, you've got less use for that kind of immune response, and it often gets diverted or hijacked or sidetracked, and can be actually a problem in terms of the very inflammatory mediators that are released. So until long COVID came along, mast cell activation syndrome was quite a niche topic and quite a niche specialty amongst hematologists and allergists. I know that it's going to rear its head a lot in a lot of long hauler discussions and a lot of long hauler clinical consultations. I regard it boringly as another one of those subjects where we need to kind of do a lot more research, because the jury is still out, and we need to do a lot more kind of measurements. There's there's something going on in this territory, isn't there? Because for example, one of the big studies that's kind of big part of my day job is we have a government funded study here in the UK called Wilco, where Wilco stands for working out the immunology of long COVID, which is, the name as it suggests, we get in hundreds of people who are long haulers, and we do hundreds of blood tests in them, and we take a very detailed clinical history from them, and we try and correlate their immunology with their symptomology. And certainly there's a whole cluster of those where something's gone on since they had their COVID, and their whole kind of allergic profile has changed. So some people would interpret that as, perhaps being compatible with those who like that kind of mast cell activation idea. It's certainly a programmatic difference there that we have to look at.
Yeah, and that's I grew up with asthma and allergies, so this is something
Yeah.
that I've sort of been watching personally. I just, for whatever reason, I seem to have escaped a lot of the pulmonary effects. I don't know why. I
Yeah,
grew up in a
yeah,
hospital. This is
yeah.
got me. Um, let's see. How do vaccines work? Why are some vaccines just one and done versus every year?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So again, I feel like during the pandemic and since, we've been on such a fast learning curve, and we've so to my mind, so exceeded any expectations. So if you think back to those terrible, terrifying days of what January 2020, when we were watching people dying despite the best possible care on intensive care, mass burials, families not able to attend burials, and we didn't know what hope there would be. And people in various parts of the world were racing to generate vaccines. And in the blink of an eye, we had more than 100 candidate vaccines around the world, and we had some, rising to the top of that pile in terms of things like the mRNA vaccines and the adenovectored vaccines, things like the J&J and the AstraZeneca one, and then after that, protein vaccines like Novavax. So they came along very, very fast, and worked far better than any of us dared to hope. Yeah, and saved us, absolutely saved us. So they worked brilliantly. Even the ones that we thought of as being bad vaccines or less good also did brilliantly. Yeah, but we had no sort of prior detailed track record in how it was going to play out, how long immunity was going to last for, how often you could re-inject them and reuse them, particularly not for the mRNA vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna, that had only been used on quite a small scale and quite small scale clinical trials before. And so that's really been a kind of steep learning curve of work in progress. And so, what have we learned? We've learned that obviously all the things I'm talking about are variations on the theme of realizing that the part of the virus called spike that we all know about is the part that it uses to get into the cell. And that's its kind of Achilles heel, because if you block that interaction with the neutralizing antibody very well, then you block it getting in. So all of the vaccines are variations on the theme of, could we get the body to express a better spike that would induce some neutralizing antibody and some T cells and stop the person getting infected or stop them getting seriously infected. And they've all to varying degrees pulled that off. And then as you sort of fast forward through the story, by the time it got to a year further on, just when we thought we were going to come out of it, two things were happening, weren't there? First of all, we were realizing that these vaccines seemed pretty miraculous, but the immunity wasn't very durable. It was sort of waning by the time people got to 6, 9, 12 months. And the other thing that scuppered us was that people like me, experts, had said, oh, coronaviruses are like the common cold. They mutate very slowly. Mutation and variants won't be a problem. And that made us look pretty stupid, because what we hadn't kind of factored into our thinking was, trillions of copies in billions of lungs of billions of people around the world. Even if the mutation rate is slower than something like HIV, that's enough mutations to keep you very, very busy forever. So along came the alpha variant, and then the delta variant, and the beta and gamma variant, and that kind of scuppered our plans. So we were then starting to think about how to have better immunity from boosting, and we were kind of in uncharted territory, and that uncharted territory has kind of continued. Again, I'd say it's gone better than we had a right to hope, and better than we dared to expect. But it saddens me sometimes when I think that all of that kind of wartime spirit of 3 years ago, when we were really, piling on the momentum and the effort and the funding to make sure that we were saving people, that's kind of been dissipated, and as if it's a job done. And I don't feel like the job has been done.
I could not agree with you more. I don't know if you remember during the Delta wave. I'm from that part of Southwest Missouri that was just ravaged by Delta. It was in the
Right,
news
right,
for
right, right.
months. It's a very conservative area. Um, it was also the very first municipality in the state, Joplin, Missouri, to reach fully 50% vaccinated, because they saw how horrific this was. And I agree. I
Yeah.
feel like that wartime push
Mm,
of
mm, mm.
togetherness is gone now. It's, I'm not afraid to say I'm not looking forward to this winter.
Exactly. No, we don't know what's coming, but
Yeah,
it's not looking calm at the moment. Yeah.
no, no. Let's see. Let's dive into this. What are T cells, and what role do CD4 cells play in the immune system? Why do I keep hearing about them?
Yeah, no, good question. So again, I talked about this steep learning curve that everybody's been on,
Right.
and so quite early on in the pandemic, even our politicians had learnt the word antibody, hadn't they? And they were getting quite good at understanding that in their minds, antibody was a kind of synonym for protective immunity, which is not a bad place to start from, because of what I just said, that if you've got neutralizing antibodies to spike, you can envisage that as kind of hanging onto the spike and preventing it from getting into cells. Okay, so that's not a bad starting point. And then as people got greedier for knowledge and started thinking about it more, and some of them even remembered their kind of schoolroom or university immunology lessons, they thought, hang on a minute, weren't we taught that the immune system actually has two arms to it? There's the antibodies, which are soluble proteins floating around in your blood, made by a kind of white blood cell called a B cell. And then there's the other half that you need that's equally as important, which are also white blood cells, also lymphocytes, and they're called T cells. And they're the things I spent my whole life working on. So to my mind, they're much more intelligent cells. And I would say that, and they're to do with the kind of a different kind of attack mode. They're primarily to do with seeing something that shouldn't be there, a virus infected cell, a bacterial infected cell, a cancer cell, and zapping it, killing it. I've spent my whole life working on those and loving them. And again, when I was a student in the dim distant past, those T cells came in two flavors. They were called CD4 or CD8, where CD4 meant they were sometimes paraphrased as helper cells, which means that they make a lot of chemicals that help different immune responses to happen, and create the right kind of environment for the immune response to happen. And the other flavor, CD8 cells, were the cytotoxic or killer cells that were zapping the tumors or zapping the infected cells. And so at the end of all of this, 3 years later, we've gone round and round in circles with the aficionados, trying to argue about when antibody is more important and when CD4 cells are more important and when CD8 cells are more important in protective immunity to COVID. And as you'd expect, at the end of it all, we've kind of agreed they're all important.
Yeah. And I'm going to back this up before I move on to the next question. How does COVID affect the immune system?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, we again, we fight about it enormously, and we're spending. It's probably the biggest experiment in our lab, is trying to do really fancy analysis of the immune system and see what's changed during COVID. And there've been many probably hundreds of papers published in the medical literature looking at this. Hard to know what we've agreed. Okay, one of the things I think we've agreed is this. It's about autoimmunity. So many people will have seen very strong publications reported in the press saying that a part of the long COVID spectrum is that we've seen, as a consequence of COVID-19 infection, an enormous rise, sometimes a doubling or trebling of what are called autoimmune diseases, things like arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, type 1 diabetes, where the common factor in all of those diseases, the reason they're called autoimmune, the clue is in the name, because the immune response is programmed to attack foreign substances, and by definition should not be attacking your own body. So it's got to know that if some if some salmonella gets in, that shouldn't be there and that has to be attacked. But if a muscle cell is there, that should be there and shouldn't be attacked. So that's a sort of basic part of its education. And in autoimmune diseases, of course, that programming goes awry, and rheumatoid arthritis is the autoimmune disease where the immune system has gone awry and is attacking targets in the synovial joints. Type 1 diabetes is the disease where that's gone awry, and you're attacking proteins in your beta cells in your pancreas that have to make insulin. Inflammatory bowel disease is the disease where you've stopped, where you've lost regulation of the immune response to your gut, and you're starting to attack your own gut. So one very simple and obvious point that we have agreed on is that one of the things that often seems to go wrong with the immune system in people who've had COVID-19 is that control is dysregulated, and there's a much bigger chance of autoimmunity. So that's one clue that we do agree on. I think that it's doing something to your immune system.
And I'm gonna, let's see, this is sort of a big heavy guns question here. What are cytokines, interleukins, and interferons, and why are they important? Why do they have important roles in COVID?
Yeah. Good question. So when I talk about T cells, particularly the CD4 and CD8 cells, being the kind of the sort of heavy artillery of the immune response, they need to kind of fire something, don't they? Artillery does need to actually sort of fire something out of the end of the gun, and what T cells are firing is a whole family of proteins that they're evolved to make. So what are some of the ones that immunologists love? They love gamma interferon, which is one of the things we measure most often, which is the kind of one of the main kind of missiles released by T cells. We also love interleukins. So again, to show you how old I am, when I was a graduate student, we discovered two interleukins called interleukin 1 and interleukin 2. We're now, I mean, I don't keep track on the numbers anymore, but we're now somewhere in the 70s or 80s or 90s of different interleukins that have been discovered. And so, what are they? They're kind of regulatory proteins that come out of the activated T cell and hang on to receptors on other cells and tell them to do things. When I use an expression like immune response, that is your immune response. It's saying, help. There's a bacterium in my lung. Let's recruit many millions of neutrophils to gather around and get rid of it. Or they're saying, help, there's an enormous worm in my guts. Let's recruit an enormous number of basophils and mast cells and Th2 cells and eject it from the gut. So it's the artillery that makes those things happen.
Okay. Well, is there anything else? We normally have a few more questions, but I think when we think of immunology, people are just they don't know where to start. What else would you like to add to this discussion?
Well, I think the I spend a lot of my time speaking to long hauler groups, and I think the biggest discussion point where we try and get some illumination is that that people are very desperate and angry and impatient, and sometimes when I speak to people, they almost feel like surely all the answers are known, and if the answers are known, then the drugs that could make them better must be known. So what's the conspiracy that's preventing them from being treated and made better? And I couldn't empathize with that, strongly enough with that, with that despair and that irritation and that anger. And the way that I try and engage in that discussion is in a few stages. The first is to say that on the one hand, from all the way that I've described it, this is essentially an immunological disease. Immunology is a very successful part of 21st century molecular medicine. If you look at how treatments of different diseases have been revolutionized, whether it's, think about cancer immunotherapy, think about multiple sclerosis, think about rheumatoid arthritis, those medical specialties are unrecognizable compared to how they looked 20 or 25 years ago. And that success story is a success story of immunology research. It's been stupendous. So that's my kind of good news, is saying if we can do a bit more research and work out a bit more about where to look, the goodies are on the shelf and ready to go. And I feel, very, very secure that we could help people. Okay. On the other hand, if you put a gun to my head today and said, okay, I'm going to give you $1 billion. You've now got to select your first 10 drugs and give them to 1,000 people each and make them better. I'm not ready to select those 10 yet, because I've only had 2.5 years of working on this, and I don't know which they are. And I don't want to kill anybody by mistake.
Right. Yeah, and like you were saying, because there are billions of people who've been affected in billions of different ways, we can't just have 10 different solutions.
Yes.
And I feel like I see a lot of that in the long COVID community, where we get excited about one thing and then another, but it's only one at a time. And if we've learned anything from this entire process, it can't be a one and only thing approach. We have to look at this collectively. So
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't agree more. So if I had any, well, people don't need my advice, but if people want my point, I would say, instead of using your dollars to go and do a sort of a one-person experiment where you pay a lot of money to somebody to give you one treatment, and then if that doesn't work, you go off and get another treatment, and maybe it'll work for you and maybe it won't. Instead of doing that, be a political activist to actually get the job done properly and at scale, and make sure that the powers that be are actually funding properly scaled, properly controlled trials, so we can get some big answers faster.
I couldn't agree more. I actually talked with Betsy a couple of weeks ago after the NIH hullabaloo and all that
Yeah, yeah,
fallout. I told her the same thing. I think we would be far better served by taking stock of what we do know currently, as opposed to reaching out for one thing at a time. Let's take a look at who knows what.
yeah,
Because surely among the the billions of pieces of this puzzle, if we take the time to take stock of them and put them all together, I think we'll get
I think
answers
so.
sooner. So, Danny Altmann, thank you so much for your time today.
Great
This
pleasure.
abbreviated session, and we hope to have you back soon. Okay, you take care.
Very, very happy. Great, great pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Good. So are we done? Yeah. Have you got enough there to kind of play with and edit and?
Oh yeah, yep. We are
Good. Well,
great. We're good to
great,
go.
great, great, really interesting and good questions, and a great, great pleasure to meet you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to meet you too. Yeah, I have a private chat on Facebook, a bunch of researchers from all different
Lovely.
areas, and they were really excited to hear that you were going to come and talk with us. So,
Great. Okay.
well,
Good.
thank you so
Well,
much for your
very well
time.
done. Thank you very much for contacting me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you. You take care.
Bye.
Mhm.